we're now going to take just a quick look at using procedural based alphas on terrains and ends up happening to them when you import them in, how to use them properly. So the first thing I'm going to do is just created a terrain, and I'm going to edit the function. We're going to make it a little more interesting. I'm going to go over to cellular patterns, Voronoi generalized, and then go into the filter and just add a point in the center. I'm going to go up here, turn on the curves, and just level that out just a little in the middle. And that'll kind of flatten some of those areas. And then I'm going to turn off zero edges. And then I also want to go into paint, and I'm going to delete the default rock that was added. Okay, so what I want to do is use a material layer that has a built-in alpha as a procedural, and you can see what happens when we load that in. I also want to note that up on top we have a procedural material preview. I recommend keeping this off, at least for the moment. Not sure if it's going to be modified at some point in the future, but for right now, it can remove what we're going to be loading in and our baked image map. So what I'm going to do is add a new material, and we're going to select to manually define the presence, and then that's going to open up the material browser here. And what I'm going to do is go to the layers, and I'm just going to select the grass layer. Actually, I am going to cancel that really quick because I do want to increase the resolution of the terrain, because once you load this in, there's not really a way to refresh it and have it bake itself without re-adding it. So we can see this a little better, I'm going to go ahead and just increase the terrain resolution. And that way we have a 1024 by 1024 image for the terrain. So go back, manually define the presence, and select that grass layer. And what I want to do is bake the alpha channel, because I don't want to remove it. Now it's going to bake that image, and we can see the distribution of that across the terrain. Now, in order to keep this image baked and not lose this distribution, you do have to paint on it immediately before you close the editor. It doesn't have to be a lot. It could just be one tiny little section. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and make sure I've got paint on. I'm going to turn off the sculpting. I just want to adjust and affect the material layer. And I'm just going to set it to airbrush and just paint that in just a little on the corner here. And that'll be just enough to lock it in place. So let's take a look at the material. I'm just going to adjust this just a little. And we can see it showing in the preview, just as it showed in the terrain editor. And under alpha production, we can see the baked image. So if we go to edit the function, right click, edit, we can see that texture scale showing up in here. And then we have the distribution that was baked from the grainy fractal, which was being used as, it looks like it was this one down here, being used as the alpha. And we just have a constant number on that end. And then this part right here is the painted procedural mask. So when we paint on the terrain, it's going to show up here and add or subtract from this. And we just did a very small amount, so you really can't see it in the image here. So now we can go through or go into the terrain. If we want to remove areas, we can invert it. So let's say we don't want it to show up in the middle here. We can erase it by using invert. And that should remove it from the center. And we can see it disappear from that circle in the middle. Let's do a quick render so we can see it a little larger. So we can see that center section removed. And it will overwrite it If we were to go back and turn off invert and now paint it in the center, it's going to override. There's no way to really get back to the image we had before. And messing around with that texture scale node to, say, reset that painted part of the material it might not always be the best idea, just because once you start messing around in the meta node, it can sometimes be a little unstable. Now, in another part of the training, I showed how you can use the layer painting to lock onto the size of the object, and that has seemed to be pretty successful for being able to extract it without causing any errors. But another thing I want to show you right now is if we go back into the terrain editor, and this has always been kind of a feature that's a little off and on when it comes to painting. I'm going to turn on the procedural terrain material, click OK, and now the entire texture disappears. And if we go into our material here, and let's say we want to paint additional areas onto it, maybe subtract some areas, let's see what happens. We can see it starts to add a few things to it. And it kind of mixes these two together. And that could be useful to pass through what we had before for the grainy fractal. If I go through and just connect that from the, remove it from the constant and add that in. And that'll allow that to go through. So that way we have that procedural alpha being passed through. But sometimes when you make changes, it will reset it. And as you can see, it just removed everything once I closed the terrain editor. So for now, I recommend turning that off. There used to be more features available for the material layers. I'm not sure if they'll bring them back at some point. But with Vue 2016, they did change the material layers and how you can manipulate them, and they removed the ability to freeze material layers, and some of the options are now gone. Whether or not they'll come back, I'm not sure. But for now, I recommend just kind of leaving that off for now. If you're going to be going back and editing the terrain and modifying the materials back and forth, it's going to be kind of a pain to have to go back into the material every time and change that constant. Another feature that looks like it was removed was the ability to refresh the procedural. Whereas before, what we could do was go into the material layer, and this is if you're familiar with Vue from previous versions. You used to be able to go into the layer and refresh the alpha, and if you had this option on up here, the material preview, it wouldn't matter what the resolution was before. You could refresh it and it would update that procedural, but it does not do that anymore. So definitely keep that in mind and make sure you have the resolution you want as an endpoint, because otherwise you're going to have to go in and do a lot of manipulation to it to get rid of the pixels and whatnot. And if we want, we can also go ahead and reset that 2D painting, which will remove everything if we want to. And now all of it's going to be gone. So even though it has kind of a few issues and an interesting workflow, it still can be a useful way to manipulate materials and paint with those alphas together and get a preview of it along with it.